Okay, well, good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us on this, well, beautiful evening. We really appreciate everybody coming along. We know it's a busy time of the year for some, hopefully. So my name is Amy Burke. I'm the Skills Manager at AHDB, and I am bringing you this webinar this evening on negotiating for success. We're going to be joined by Ged and Charlie, which I'll get them to introduce themselves shortly. But just to manage your expectations, we're really going into a light touch approach on negotiation. As you can imagine, it's a huge topic, but this evening we're going to tease you with some top tips, and we look forward to your feedback to see if this is something we should explore further in the AHDB skills activity. So a bit of housekeeping. So everybody's going to be muted as we progress through this evening. But if you have any questions, there is a box on the right hand side. Type those in. What we're going to do is we're going to ask those at the end. If there's anything really urgent, we can ask them to the speakers, but we try to keep them for the end. If we don't have time, we'll get through to them after the webinar and post them on our website. So there is also a chat box, so there's questions and chat. If you have any technical difficulties, put your comments in there, and Luke, who's sitting behind the scenes, will be able to support you and help you through that. So we're aiming to go for about an hour, hopefully finish about at 8 o'clock, and the recording will be emailed to you with a survey, so please feel free to feedback on how we've done. Just a couple more points. So this evening you can get Dairy Pro, Pig Pro and Basis points. If you didn't submit your request for these points when you signed up, then put your details in the question box, which is anonymous, no one else will be able to see, and we'll ensure that you get those Basis points allocated. Okay, so some introductions then. As mentioned, Amy Burke, that's probably about enough from me. My details up at the end if you've got any questions. But really, I'm going to hand over straight away to Charlie. So Charlie, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, thanks, Amy. I'm Charlie Thompson. I'm a sixth generation farmer in Northamptonshire. So we are a pig, arable and formerly poultry business. We've got a nucleus pig farm, which we're currently expanding a little bit. We expand a lot of pig. We export a lot of pigs all over Europe and further afield. And our arable business, we have contracting farming business, as well as farming some of our own kind of land in hand as well. So I think I'm on here to give a farmer's opinion on some of the negotiation skills that Jed's going to talk about, and it's actually been really interesting for me to chat to Ged and go through, think about kind of where you are actually negotiating. So it's quite an interesting thing to think about actually when you start going through this presentation. So I'm looking forward to talking through a few things with Ged tonight.
Thank you, Charlie. So yeah, you've got quite a lot juggling on your plate, so it'd be interesting to understand a bit more about how you negotiate your own priorities. And then hand over to Ged if you want to introduce yourself, and then let's just get straight into it.
Right, yes, I'm Ged Futter. I am the director of a company called The Retail Mind. If you go to the next slide, then you can see where I've come from. So I spent about 26 years in retail. So I started off in stores. I worked for IKEA, for Toys R Us, for Habitat, managing stores. But actually then I spent most of my time at ASDA. When I was at ASDA, I was a senior buying manager in a few categories. So I worked in core grocery, I worked in beer, and I worked in frozen food. So you can see some of the suppliers that I worked with there. Actually in frozen food, actually I was looking after meat, poultry, fish and chips, potatoes and veg. So in effect, that was the frozen meat category and the frozen produce category. So that's what I was looking after. And each category is roughly about £500 million worth of turnover. I left there about 6 years ago. Over to the next slide, and you can see what I've been doing. So now what I do is I do training and consulting. So I work with suppliers who work with the retailers, because I thought actually there's a lot of suppliers out there, and there's than there are retailers, and I thought I'd done my stunt working in a retailer's, and now I help suppliers to work better with the retailers and do things like this, talking about negotiation, selling, and how you can actually look to save money. This is what we've saved our clients in the past 12 months. We've saved about £24 million over the past by working with us. And what we're going to look at today is just the negotiation part of what we do, because that was the key part of what I did when I was at AHDB. Okay. So we've got the first poll, I believe, just finding out when do you negotiate?
So just for the audience, on the right hand side, you should see an option to answer the poll. So hopefully you should be able to select one of the following. If you have any problems, once again, just pop that in the chat, and we're just going to give you a minute to answer that, and then we'll see your answers. And once again, everything's anonymous, so don't feel nervous. Please be honest.
And there is no right or wrong answer.
Okay, so here come the answers. There you are, Ged.
Okay, so we can see that most of you negotiate on a daily basis, some of you weekly, monthly, annually. So some of you say you only negotiate on an annual basis, and about 20% of you say on an ad hoc basis. Well, I've got 2 kids, 2 teenage kids, so I'm negotiating pretty much every single day. So when we think about negotiation, you might think, actually, well, I just do it when I'm buying grain on an annual basis. But actually, if you think about when you are negotiating, most of us are negotiating it in one form or another on a pretty regular basis. So be it either internally with a family or friends, kids, but also externally as well. So one of the things that obviously I've left AHDB, but if you think about an example, when I'm looking to get a new mobile phone contract or gas or electric, all these kind of things, broadband, there's a negotiation to be had. So the more you start thinking about when are you negotiating, the more you can practice some of the skills that we're going to look at and talk about today. Okay, next slide. So what we're going to cover today, and it is, as Amy said, it's a very light touch look at negotiation, because I said the people I negotiated with when I was at AHDB varied from huge multinational companies to actually to really small startups. And the things that we always looked at when I was negotiating, this is what I was always thinking about. The first thing was actually alternatives, always having an alternative. And the second one actually was a walk away point. So what actually was my walk away point? Where did I get to a negotiation think, I cannot do this, I have to walk away? Time is something that always is important in negotiation. Do you know if time is being used against you, or are you using time? Have you given yourself enough time to plan? And that's that one down at the bottom. That's those steps. So there's 5 steps. We're not going to go through all 5 steps. We're going to look at some of the key ones today. So there's some of the things. And then one of the most important ones actually is power. So in a negotiation, who has the power? Do you have the power? Does the person you're negotiating with have the power? Do they know they've got the power? All these kind of things, thinking about that. And what's something that Charlie mentioned when we were talking about it, and actually what we're not going to cover today, actually that's confidence. How confident are you when you're negotiating? Because actually, the more you do it, the more confident you get. And actually, that's something that happened with me over times. And I think how I ended up negotiating to when I first started, I was a very different person. But that's because I was doing it a lot. So I was negotiating with people over huge contracts. And the more I did it, the more confident I got, and the more confident I got in my style as well. Okay.
I think that's one thing that I think is key from a farm's point of view is often we feel like we're negotiating against people who are used to doing this every day, and I think that's one thing we gaining that confidence and having the confidence to engage in negotiations is really key, I think, because the more you practice it, even on small scales, and think about this process, I think kind of really gives you kind of much more confidence to push the bigger negotiations harder as well.
Absolutely. And I think if you think about how you can learn, there are little things that you can do, and actually if you have some little wins, then they give you the confidence when you are getting to the big ones. So the most important part actually is think about it. Think about what you're doing. Okay, next slide. So alternatives. When I was doing negotiation, this is something that I learned, and actually it was the point for me, it was the most important thing, having an alternative. So when I was negotiating with different suppliers, I would always try and get an alternative. And actually that's something that I became good at. And the reason why I became good at that is because I was always thinking about what can I do? So who am I negotiating with? What's their competition? What can I do to work with them? But also, why do I need an alternative? Sometimes what you'll think actually is there's only one person here that I can get this from. And that's what I had a couple of times. There was only one supplier I could get this from. And then when a new smaller supplier came in, I wanted to work with them because what I wanted is I wanted an alternative so that I could work with somebody else to make sure I was getting the best price. Because then when I got the best price, I could pass those savings on. And think about when do you need an alternative, and when is the best time to think about that? One of the reasons why you need alternatives is actually because all your negotiations are teeing up for the next negotiation. What you're doing is you are actually training the person you're negotiating with that this is your style. So if the person that you're negotiating with always knows that you've got an alternative, when you say, I've got this price here and I can go there, or I've got this is why I'm going, they know that you're serious. So sometimes you need to do it. You need to have that opportunity to walk away. Can you think of any time, Charlie, where you've had an alternative and you've been able to use it?
Yeah, I think it's definitely something we've worked really hard on over the last few years. I think is planning far more before we even enter the negotiation process. But even as part of the negotiation process is thinking about alternatives. So thinking about if it's a bit of machinery that we're looking to buy at the moment, for example, we will try and think around the problem more. Think about how could we deliver this if we didn't use this bit of machinery? Is there multiple options? Are there different ways we could do it, or staff it, or manage that situation without that bit of kit? And also kind of costing what that might save, and kind of really think about the problem, because I think the more you think about it, the better informed you are when you get to the negotiation time. You can justify why you're going to a certain price. You can justify different options that might enter the fray. And also talk to suppliers about other options as well, because often people have different ideas. There's not always one. Like you said, in terms of alternatives, there's very rarely one way of doing something. There are some cases that you can only get one thing from one person, but often in agriculture, there's often a few different options that you can think about that might be able to solve your problem on farm.
I think that part just that you talked about there is absolutely key. It's information. I always used to think of negotiations and buying as a bit of a jigsaw. And actually, I was given all the different pieces, but I didn't have the picture. So I had to put all the pieces together. And actually, that was from talking with different people. So the more information that I got, the stronger I could be with where I was going with my negotiation. So getting hold of information, talking to different people, is really critical to being successful in negotiation. Okay.
You mentioned the walk away point, but I think almost sometimes you sometimes find different alternatives that change your mind altogether. And that's, even though for me, when I first thought about it, I didn't think about that as a negotiation, but it's part of negotiating your success on farm almost, isn't it? It's about kind of producing the right result at the end of the day.
Absolutely.
Can I just, sorry, I do apologise. There is a question just come through and I was thinking it myself. What does BATNA mean?
BATNA is best alternative to a negotiated agreement. So it's basically is your best alternative. So if you can't actually come to an agreement, what have you got? That is your alternative. So it's abbreviated.
Thank you. Sorry.
Okay, right. So I just talked about just now, walk away point. Now, having a walk away point, knowing that actually you will not go any further in a negotiation because of a certain price, or because you've been asked to do something that you just cannot do. You've got to have thought about that beforehand. If you thought about it beforehand, if you've got your alternatives in place, that's when the walk away point becomes really powerful, because you know that you can do it. So having your walk away point and actually saying, actually, well, no, this is my final offer, this is my best offer. Never say this is your best offer if it's not your best offer, because the more you say that, then you're giving things away, and for the next negotiation, someone's always thinking, well, you said that last time, and actually you could do something different. Okay, next slide. Time is something that I used on multiple occasions, particularly when I was negotiating. Actually, for me, a lot of the stuff, products that I was negotiating, buying, time was really important because they were seasonal. So when I was buying vegetables and chips, and potatoes, then the harvest is at a certain point. When I was buying gherkins, that I was thinking, well, where are they coming from? I actually had to know that if you in one country you get one harvest, in another country you get 2 harvests. So the more that you can think about the time, when is the right time to do a negotiation? How can you use time in your favor? When you're buying a piece of machinery, if it's coming to the end of the month, is that the time when the salesman really has got a bonus they want to hit? Is it when you get into the end of a financial year? Thinking about when is the best time and how can you use time, but also think, how are they using time? Are they trying to put you under time pressure? Say, well, actually, I need an answer by close of play today. If I can't get an answer by today, then I can't do that deal. I bet most of the time when they say that, if you went back the next day, you could get that deal. So it's all the time thinking about how can you use time. Are there any sort of times of the year, Charlie, when you think, actually, I really need to be getting this negotiation done now?
Well, I think as a farm, or as farmers, I sometimes think we're always busy. We don't spend enough time planning, and that's part of the problem. Is sometimes we feel like we're going somebody with a time restraint placed upon us, and that's where I think, a bit like you spoke about earlier, the more time you can spend planning, thinking about when you're going to plan these purchases, rather than suddenly thinking, oh, I need this now. As soon as you're in that position, I know you're going to cover a little bit of that in a bit, but
absolutely,
from our point of view, it's easy to get distracted and very busy on farm, and suddenly kind of time runs away with you, and I think that can cost us in a negotiating position, that's for sure.
You're absolutely right, and actually, it's the thing that for me, time is the most precious resource that we've got. So if we can manage our time better, then actually give ourselves time, because what you're giving yourself is you're giving yourself time to think, and actually thinking time is really important. It can be coming from anywhere, but giving yourself that time to think is absolutely crucial. Okay,
I'm not feeling time pressured by them, like you said. I think it's
absolutely
it's feel like they have the power, they can push you on a time point of view, and I think often going quiet and backing off something is quite powerful as well.
Yeah, and what you have to recognize is that they're using time against you, and it's a tactic. So in negotiation, there are all sorts of tactics that people use, and if you can recognize it as a tactic, call it out as a tactic, then that puts the power back to you, which I'm going to come on to a little bit later on. Okay, next slide. So what we've got, we always talk about the 5-step process. So the first part actually is about planning. Do you want to use the next reveal? Here we go. So planning, debating, proposing, bargaining, and the last part is all about the agreement. and there should actually be 80% of your time is done in those first 4 parts. And actually, of that time, the vast majority of time should be done up front and move on to planning. You'll move it to the next slide. Right, so let's see who plans every negotiation. This is a simple one. I think it's a yes or no. Who plans every negotiation?
Okay, so we're back to the poll. The poll last time seemed to work very well. So if you just take a minute to answer this, probably a bit shorter because it should be a quick one.
Yeah, absolutely. You don't have to think hard. It's quite an easy one.
There we are. And just to let you know that we're expecting answers. We've got 60 people this evening, Jed, so we should be getting answers from 60 people.
Okay, I think, yes, so a quarter of you say you plan for every negotiation. Most of you said you don't. And that's, you know what, I think that's about fair. I didn't plan for every negotiation. I wanted to. I certainly planned for the big ones, but sometimes there's things come up on an ad hoc basis and you're there thinking, right, what am I going to do? So sometimes you can't plan because things are thrown at you. So you've got to be able to deal with what's being thrown at you. But actually, planning is really important. So actually, maybe you can't plan for every negotiation, but trying to plan for certainly the negotiations that matter. And what you need to do there actually is, Charlie's mentioned it already, actually, is do your research, have your alternatives. So when you talk about the research, actually, that's using trade. Look, what way can you get sort of trade press, the internet, people that you know, colleagues, other farmers. Who can you talk to? Who actually is? And actually, if you think about it, actually, who is best at that thing that I'm going to negotiate with? Who always gets the best deal? Go and learn from them, find out what they've got, see what they can do. And when you are doing, the important thing actually is that you plan it and you think about, right, this is what I've got to have. So when I've got to have this, but these are things that I'd like to have. So get them all listed down. So then when you are going in and you're having your negotiations, you can say, you can really clear, well, if I haven't got that, I have to walk away. But if I've got all these little things on top, then actually that's the sort of thing. What sort of things would you like? Would you put down and you'd like to have list then, Charlie?
While planning,
Yeah.
I think it depends what you're buying. Obviously, if you're looking at machinery and things like that, it's looking at kind of exactly what spec you want, what you could fall back to, what age you're looking at, what kind of how many hours you're looking on the clock. Yeah, you've got lots of things, particularly on machinery, you're looking for. When I'm planning things like buildings, I'll be thinking about costing out. You start with a wish list and you back down, don't you? It's that's part of negotiation and part of planning for what you want and need as well. So it's not just about negotiation, it's about kind of everything you're trying to do on farm again a bit.
Absolutely. What would you say, where have you found as best sources? So if you're researching, what's been a source that's really stood out for you as somewhere that you actually, well, you always get some good information here?
I think it's dealing with suppliers, kind of sometimes getting suppliers on site. Sometimes when we're looking at different building systems, it's getting different people out. Everyone comes up with a different idea sometimes, and you as the farmer can stitch a lot of that stuff together. Often people are very good at delivering their own idea, but you can link them together sometimes with different suppliers, and that creates a full picture as well. So it's using all these suppliers, not jumping straight into the buying and talking about. It's just it's using the time, planning, getting these guys out, using the knowledge that all these guys have, and being able to stitch it all together. Because I think that the more time you spend doing that, the more kind of power you've got in the negotiation as well.
Yeah, you know, I think that is a really powerful one there. So getting people away from their place and actually getting them to your site. So if they come and see, that's one of the things I used to do as a buyer. I always used to love going to people's factories, because when I went to people's factories, I could see these are all the things that they do that I didn't even know they do, because I was being sold to. So I was being sold to people who thought they knew what I wanted. And sometimes you don't know what the options are until you've had somebody else there. So actually someone coming to your site, coming to your farm and looking, having those discussions, is a much more comfortable way to do it as well. Okay, next slide.
So can I just, I was just thinking as you was talking then, you was talking about where do you go to research any resources, and I was thinking about some of the AHDB tools. So we've got the MI data, market information data, and we've also got sort of pricing. And I know a lot of farmers would probably look at our future prices to see what's their alternatives for when they're selling their crops. So I didn't know, Charlie, whether you looked at any of those resources at all.
Yeah, I think it's a great way of looking online and looking at different resources that the AHDB have. I think it's a good portal to link a lot of information together as well, to save you having to go to lots of different websites.
Perfect. Okay, how not to negotiate. Just got a quick short clip for you now, just to see, don't do it like this.
Okay.
Right. So what you could see there, and it does make me laugh. Sometimes I used to watch The Apprentice, and it just made me cringe, because you could see exactly how not to do something. The guy went in completely unprepared, didn't know his market, didn't know what, and the way that he went, and you could see everybody was cringing. His people who were on his team were cringing, because he just didn't know what he was doing when he went in there. That is we're going to look a bit later. We're going to look at, well, how to do it well, but that's just some examples of making sure that you don't go in there with an outrageous ask to people, because you can see the person he was negotiating with was just shaking his head right from the start, and you don't want someone to be shaking their heads right from the start. Okay, think about the words that you're using, and actually, because quite often if you're using some of the words, then, and he used some of those words in the clip just now. So about, around, roughly, between, I'd like. When you're saying things like that, so I would rough, or if someone came to me and says, how much is going to be? Oh, well, it's going to be between 10p unit and 20p unit. I would say, well, actually, well, fine, I'll take the 10p unit price, please. Because actually that's what you're doing in a way. So if you're giving things away like that, think about the words that you use. So I need it now, or I'm desperate, or you're the last person I've come into, or getting there last minute in a day, and thank goodness you're here. All of that kind of language gives it away. What do you think you're like with words like this, Charlie? Is this something that do you give money away?
Try not to, but I don't know. It's obviously there's times you get caught, but I guess hopefully they're the more transactional type negotiations. And I guess sometimes I feel like the negotiations with those types of suppliers are more about service and how they provide it, and a more long-term kind of a relationship for some of those things that sometimes you need on a more ad hoc basis. Because I guess from a farmer's point of view, sometimes it's like you need a part for this to fix it right now, and I guess that's where it's about planning earlier in the process to have a relationship with a supplier that you're getting a realistic price, I guess.
Yeah, and it is about that. It's about that being real. It is about being realistic, and so that is one of the key things about negotiation. The more planning that you've done beforehand, the more realistic you can be with what you're asking about. Okay, next slide. So step 2, that's to propose. So actually this is about, and it's important to think basically is how can you make something contingent? So if you, then I. So if you give me X price, then I can sign on the line today. The important part here actually is listening. Listen to the person you're negotiating with. Quite often I'll be in a negotiation, and what I could do is I could use silence. And the way I would use silence, because if I was silent, then the person I was negotiating with, quite often an account manager, they would talk. And the more that they talked, the more information that they gave me. And actually, all I had to do is basically just sit and let the information come to me. And I can think, because then actually what you're doing actually is you're thinking about, well, actually, well, they just told me this. They really need it now, or they haven't had anything recently. So you're identifying the strengths, your strengths, their strengths. And it really helps you to understand where the power actually lies. Would you say that you're someone who is good at keeping quiet, Charlie, or someone who likes to fill the silence?
Yeah, this made me laugh when we were doing the practice for this, because I'm terrible with silence, absolutely terrible. I think it's a real weakness of mine, but I guess it's for me it's about understanding that and trying to identify when I can do better in those kind of positions as well, and be better at. I think I'm good at listening, but I think if somebody plays a silent trick on me, I'll fill it with them, and making sure I don't fill it with something that gives things away from my point of view. So
the silence, I think the silence trick is one you can have a lot of fun with. So actually, when you and actually as well, you purposely keep quiet and just see how long. See if the other person can keep quiet. So actually, so who's gonna say something first? So, and it's just as a bit of fun. Oh, I wouldn't do it all the time, but just acting then. That's particularly if you have someone that you've been negotiating with for a bit in the past. Then you just see how good they are with silence and whether they want to fill it. Okay, next step. So, how often do you haggle?
So another poll. I really like the term haggle. It brings me back to being in Morocco and in the markets, and obviously the culture there is you must haggle, mustn't you? It's seen
absolutely
as
yeah. So that's seen as actually, because if you're not haggling, then you're not doing it properly.
Do you think it's a British culture that either we don't have the confidence, or we feel that it's rude to haggle over a price?
Yeah, I think so, sometimes it is, and we get it. I think haggle is something you have to, for most people, you have to teach yourself to do. Haggling is not something, to be honest, I'm brilliant at, because a haggle quite often is something that you'll do it with someone who you're having just more of a one-off. Or you're trying to get a little bit extra. I was always really good at long-term negotiations and doing things over the long term. Short-term haggling was never something I was good at. Although I did once to get quite a good deal when I was actually on buying some leather goods when actually that I think it was out in Italy. So I was quite pleased about that one. So here's the results. So some of the time, half you say, some of the time, most of the time, 26%, and 10% of you are haggling all the time. So, and actually, the important thing to know actually is, and to work out, is when is the right time to haggle? Because if you're doing it all the time, some people actually, I always think about negotiation as a bit of a dance. Some people like to have a dance. So there's always, if I was working with a supplier who would always like to haggle, then I'd know I'd have to keep something back, because actually if I wasn't haggling back with them, they'd be disappointed. And actually that's what we've got here. This is all that step 4. It's about bargaining. So the important part about bargaining and haggling is to know when to do it. What you don't do is you don't go in and haggle right at the start. You need to listen. You need to understand whereabouts you are in the negotiation to start off with. And actually, well, why are you haggling? Why are you bargaining? What is it you want? And then who? Think about actually who are you going to be bargaining or haggling with? And actually, because what the important part actually is, what we used to call it actually was actually who was the fox in the room. And actually, because the fox was the person who really held the purse keys, who was the most important person that actually you would go to. Because actually the higher up you go, the more likely they are to give something away. That's what we always found. Actually, the more senior they are, because actually they're looking at a bigger picture, and actually they've got a bigger pot, so they can give things away a little bit easier. What's the best example that you can see when you've gone and done some bargaining, Charlie?
Oh, sorry, I was muted there. Yeah, I wouldn't say I was particularly good at bargaining in these kind of markets. I remember getting taken for a complete ride by for a t-shirt in Thailand at one point. But I think yeah, I don't think I do a lot of haggling as a farmer at the moment. Anyway, I guess I'm not involved in some of the trading aspects of it, but I think some of the more bargaining where I feel like I'm bargaining is often about services and things like that as well that come alongside, or suppliers. It's looking at kind of the service that they're giving you, how you can upgrade that, how you can kind of get a little bit more out of people, and include a bit more all the time, rather than sometimes kind of haggling. I think I wouldn't say that I'm particularly haggling a lot in my role.
And I think that's the important thing. Actually, it is about bargaining and haggling. Actually, one thing as you talked about just now is it's not always about price. And actually, that when we're talking about and we're training our suppliers, we always try and say price should be the last thing that you talk about, because of all the other variables that you've got. And that's where, when you've done your research, when you've planned things out, the more variables you've got, those are things you can talk about, can use before you actually get to price. If you've actually been caught on the hop, then quite often all you can bargain with basically is price, and that is just one trick that you've got. So always think about what else you can do.
I've just got a bit of a question here, if you don't mind, Ged and Charlie. So we've been talking about bargaining if you were to purchase something, but bargaining, I guess, works the same way if you're selling something. So it's understanding the same steps, so you understand, I guess, what it costs you to produce the items, so you know where you're starting with your bargaining. Does it work the same way, Ged?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, selling is exactly the same. That's what we talk about when we're doing the selling skills workshop. We talk about actually the important thing for selling actually is again it's about relationships. And actually, so what you're going to be doing basically is just making it all about price.
And I think, sorry to add in on this as well, is I think sometimes when I'm selling as a you're always looking to add extras to that as well. So it's a little bit like you're talking about the bargaining. Sometimes there's bits that people often want, and it's making sure that you charge for them as well, and that's part of the bargaining part of it as well, because that's one thing I think we've done better at recently as a farm in various negotiations, is always making sure things that you sometimes give away for free as a farm, I think as a farmer, sometimes I feel like we do. We need to remember we can charge for some of these things, and adding value to some of the things that we do as a farm. So I think that's key in a lot of negotiations as well.
Absolutely. So giving away things for free is absolutely, that's critical. What could you, most times there's always somebody out there that will buy it off you. So what can you not give away for free? Okay, next step. So the last part, and this is the agreement, and it's all the important part here is when you've got that agreement, getting it signed, getting it down, someone signing on the bottom line. And the one thing we always used to think about actually is one more thing. So when the person you're negotiating with, make sure that they sign first. When their pen's just hovering over that sign, you say, oh, one more thing. So if it's a piece of machinery, can you chuck in 2 years free service as well? So thinking about the little things that you can, particularly if it's not like a service, then that'd be a different department to sales. So something that they might want to say just all they want is to sell. So can you think of an example where you've done that, Charlie, where you've been right on the dotted line and you've just got in a little bit extra?
Yeah, I think it's very similar to your example. Essentially, it's making sure you're very clear about what you're looking for and kind of trying to add those little extras in at the end, but also making sure that's in the agreement as well, and making sure that's written down, there's a paper trail about it, and making sure they're followed up. Like sometimes sales guys are desperate to get the machinery on site and it arrives and it's pretty obvious certain things haven't happened. It's making sure you follow up on those things as well, from my point of view.
Yeah, and that's getting everything really clear. So and that's why your agreement, they're absolutely clear, right? This is what we expect. This is what we've paid for. This is what we're going to get. This is when we're going to get it. So once you've got a really good agreement, and because the other thing you have to remember is the end of that negotiation is actually setting up the next negotiation, because negotiations are all about learning. Because of what you're thinking down, you're always trying to train the person you're negotiating with, so that they know how good a negotiator you are. So if they see, right, okay, well, I can't get away with that, I can't not do that because I know it'll be written down in the agreement, then what you're doing is you're training the other person, because that's the other person. Then when you're doing that, that other person is thinking about you, and that's the more they're thinking about what you're going to do next, the less they're thinking about what they're going to do next. And actually that's what you want. You want them to be in your head, so then they're up there one step behind you. Okay, next step. So power, this is always one of the most important things, and actually it's something that be given away. It's given away really freely. And actually one of the things that people underestimate actually is how much power that you have and they have as well. And actually, the more research that you can do, the more planning that you can do, quite often you can unpick where the power actually lies. So one of the things we talked about actually is the alternatives. If you've been using the same person for buying something for years and years and years, they think they've got all the power, because every year you come back to them. Quite often it might be on the same day of the same month every year. You come back and you either give them a phone call or you walk through the door, and they've got it in their diary. They know you're coming back, so they think that they've got the power. But what happens when you don't come in on that day, or when you don't phone them up, or you phone them up and say, actually this year I'm going somewhere else? Where does the power shift to then? So also think about actually what power do they have and what power do you have? What about yourself, Charlie? How do you actually think about sometimes about actually what sort of that in this way?
Yeah, it's easy to slip into kind of going back to the same suppliers because you've got a relationship. Like we've just done a mini expansion recently and looked at a few different projects, and we were very careful to make sure we actually did use a different building supplier at one point, and it really helped to the normal supplier that we normally work with to understand that we are looking at options, we are being careful exactly what we're examining, getting multiple prices in, and I think that worked really well in our favor. So also it made us, it's more part of the planning situation as well, bringing multiple suppliers in, put put things back in our control as well, in terms of just taking what a supplier wants to give you isn't necessarily the best thing for your business. And I think that's one thing we've done a lot more of, is be more demanding almost, and push for exactly what you want to be part of your expansion, essentially, etc.
I think that's critical, actually. So giving yourself options. Now, what I am not advocating is that every year you're chopping and changing and you're always moving about between different people, because then actually what you're not doing is you're not building good relationships. And actually a good relationship, actually, where both sides understand that everyone's got a bit of power. They could go somewhere else and you could go somewhere else. So actually that you can have a proper and honest conversation when it comes to negotiation. Actually, then what you're doing is you're talking about adding value. It's less about that dance. It's less dancing around price, and it becomes a much richer conversation. And then getting them, as Charlie said, getting people involved in what you're doing. So then they can see actually they've got something invested in it as well. And it's not just, and then what they'll see is actually, well, it's not just about this year, but it's also about next year. If all that you're doing is moving your products and your negotiations every year, then actually what you're not building up is trust. And that's what you want to be building up with people. You actually want to build up that trust. That's how I always worked as a buyer. I wanted my suppliers to know that they could rely on me, but I also wanted them to know that if I said I had a price and I had an alternative. So it's about understanding the power and not abusing that power on either part, because actually that doesn't help in any negotiation, because actually what you got then is you got an ego getting in the way. Okay,
there's a limit to knowing everything as well, but also like having the learning, but being more invested in what you're buying, and not just taking what the supplier is used to supplying, kind of getting more involved in understanding the type of farrowing crate, for example, in our expansion, the type of feed system, kind of really pushing things and finding alternatives for that, how the ventilation works, etc. Like it's really starting to understand those areas. That puts the negotiating position back into your hands, because you can then ask far more detailed questions to the supplier to make sure they're delivering on what they can easily kind of say that they're always just producing mass market, essentially.
Yeah, and then what you're introducing is variables, and the more variables you can introduce, then that makes your negotiation, I think, that much easier. Okay, next slide. So this is what we've covered, and it has been a whistle-stop tour through some core negotiation principles today. So the one that, for me, this is where I actually was most successful, is by having alternatives. And if you've got alternatives aligned with your walk-away point, then that puts you in a really powerful place. And you've got to be able to think about, actually, well, how can you use time? When is the best time to negotiate? When's the best time for you? When's the best time for them? Understand, you think about those steps. And if you think about all those steps, I would say that there's two important steps. The first part is the planning, and the second one actually to think about actually is the agreement, getting it written down. If you plan well and you've got it all written down, then that means your negotiation actually is far more likely to be successful, not just this time, but next time as well. Think about the power. Who has got the power? How can you shift that power? So actually that sometimes shifting the power can take a bit of time. And I had that with some of my suppliers. Sometimes it took me 12 to 18 months to get things in place. But that meant that actually I was a bit more control of what I did with the negotiations as well.
I think one thing you mentioned, Jed, I know you've kind of touched on it, is, and I think it's key to what we're trying to do, is to show that we're a progressive business and that we're looking at the future, and kind of putting a longer plan sometimes in front of suppliers as well, kind of builds their confidence in the direction you're going. And it's not necessarily that it's all going to come their way, but it's seeing that you are there, you are developing, you are kind of constantly looking at the future, and you're not there to buy something and then disappear as well. So I know you mentioned that a little bit, but that's certainly where we're trying to do in the building planning. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that actually that is key, because one of the things that, I mean, I was called a buyer, but actually a lot of the time I was a seller, because I knew that people I was buying from had other places they could sell. I wanted them to sell to me. I wanted them to feel confident in me and in the long term and what I was trying to sell to them. So actually, yeah, I was a buyer, but actually there was as much selling of me and the company I was working for as there was buying as well. So actually, we're all buyers and sellers, and it's understanding what we're doing and how we can get that across. So let's have a look at what's up next. How to do it well. So we've got a couple of short examples. So there you go, a couple of how to do it well. So in the first one, what I liked about that first one actually is she was really clear about, if you can order more, I will give you a better price. And in the second one, actually, there was about, well, it was the guy who was buying a book, and he put two prices on the table, didn't he? So actually, when they were selling it, just, oh, you know what, we'll take the higher price, please. That's what we're selling it, so you will give us the higher price. So always think about your language and think about how you can do that. So just if you got a few top tips now. So plan, always be planned. The better planned, the better prepared you are, the better your negotiation will go. Always know your alternatives. And sometimes you haven't got one. And if you haven't got one, then don't try and bluff, because if you try and bluff and you can't walk away, then that gets really tricky. So, but also you have to be prepared to walk away. Know when actually this is a bad deal and I just can't, if I'm doing it, it's not going to be good for anybody. Use time in your favor. Think about when is the best time. Think about who has the power. Think about the language that you use, the words. Are you giving money away? And then prepare for the next negotiation, because it is a cycle. Some of the stuff that you're negotiating will be an annual cycle, and the more prepared you are for each year, the better you will be. Any more top tips that you can think of, Charlie?
No, I think that's pretty good. You're much better than me.
So I think.
Sorry. Okay, so we have got some really good questions coming through, so I'll just quickly run through my housekeeping finally, and then I'll hand over some questions. So next step, so we've got our next webinar is the 12th of October, and that's motivational superhero. You can find out more about that on our webpage. The recording for this will be sent after the webinar. And any tools or any linked resources that we might have discussed, such as the MI data or how to calculate your costs, are all on our website. So we will send a link around for those, and you'll be able to find everything there. So thank you, Ged. I really appreciate that, because I can imagine taking a 2-day workshop and putting it into 45 minutes is a challenge in itself. And thank you very much, Charlie, for bringing your experiences to life and really showing what it's like. So I'll run through some of these questions, but anybody who's listening who still has a real burning question, pop it in the question box on the right hand side. So first, great question. So what's the difference from this type of negotiation to when you need to negotiate with your staff or with your team or you know, with your family? So that style of negotiation.
I think every negotiation, what you have to think about actually is well, is this a one-off negotiation, or is this somebody I'm going to be working with and talking to all the time? If this is someone that you want to be working with all the time, then the important part for me actually, I believed in honesty. So I'd say if I can either do something or I can't. And for me, that's the clearer you are about what you can and what you can't do with everybody, I think that's important. And actually, because then what you're doing is you're setting the boundaries. And I think that's really, really important for any negotiation. What are the boundaries? What are you not going to go over? And actually just don't, well, I always thought you have to treat people with respect in any negotiation. So actually you'll always look at it. So don't think of it, if you think about who you're working with, either family or friends, try not to negotiate all the time.
Yeah, they might think you're trying to get some all the time.
Yeah.
And how about yourself, Charlie? So I'd imagine you probably work with your colleagues, or you know, people you work with. How do you go about negotiating in that scenario? Because as you say, you don't want to sit there and put a commercial offering on the table. You want it to be a bit more informal, but as Ged said, honest.
Yeah, I think honestly, and like trying to get people to understand, I guess from a staff point of view, it's talking about kind of what we need to achieve, understanding the goals of what we're trying to do, kind of from that point of view, kind of negotiation probably comes in, and planning the workload as well, trying to spread the good and bad and the bad bits out of what we've got to achieve, and being clear about what you're doing as well, because I think clarity in the negotiation is really clear, because there's nothing worse than walking away not really understanding what the outcome of that kind of semi-negotiation was, I guess. And the other thing is probably in negotiations with staff about salary and things like that, I guess it's kind of involving that as part of it, an appraisal system, and kind of going through, being fairly open about that as well, I guess. That's what we try to be, is get people to understand our position as a business, and what options we've got available, and kind of listen to them as well. Like Ged said, it's about listening as much to them, because often in negotiations it's often not about pay, in my opinion, in terms of what we're offering as a business, in terms of as an employer.
Absolutely, I completely agree. And I think one of the phrases that I can remember what happened this evening was, if you, then I. So if, like you described in an appraisal, if you want more holiday, if you work harder, then I'll provide that holiday. So it's that spot, the bargaining, was it? The language. Fantastic. So the next question then is, this is a bit of a difficult one. So when would you, when must you walk away? At what point do you actually think I've definitely got to walk away?
I would walk away actually if the cost to me was something that was not something that wasn't palatable. So actually, and sometimes when I was it was a cost. I was getting a cost price that I couldn't sell something at. Well, so you have to think about, well, why would you walk away? You'd only walk away in an extreme. Actually, you'd walk away because you can get a better price, or you can get more from somebody else. So that's why you would walk away, because the offer on the table somewhere else. But sometimes you might just walk away and say, you know what, I can't do it today. because it's going to cost me too much. So that's why you would walk away. But you have to have thought about that beforehand. That's why the planning is so important.
So yeah, so it comes back to all that planning, understanding where your break point is, and then just the
understanding your cost of production as well. Sorry, going back to which I think farms are terrible for. We're all very good at running around and being very busy, but maybe not understanding our costs all the time. So I think sometimes understanding your cost of production, working out what the value of that piece of machinery is, what the value of that extra building is, what the value of there's always a cost to everything that you're trying to do, and it's appreciating what it's costing out that properly, and trying to evaluate that, kind of future plan that in terms of financial plan that as well.
And it's also about the hidden costs. So what are the hidden costs as well that sometimes you don't think about, but actually when you dig into it, you think, blimey, I didn't even think about it. And actually all of a sudden that makes a deal really attractive.
Yeah, absolutely. And a great point you raise, Charlie, about cost of production, because there is this fantastic tool called Farm Bench on the AHDB website. So please feel free to have a look at that and Google that. So I'll just do one quick question before we wrap up. So this is a good one. Any tips on body language negotiating? And I'm going to put this to Charlie and ask, have you ever been in a negotiating circumstance, potentially going to buy something and someone's body language just instantly put you off, and what was it that you thought, oh, that's not for me, and talk about experience?
Yeah, I think it's as much as we're doing this by webinar, and we've talked about how you can do a lot of things by webinar, kind of seeing somebody in person and seeing their body language, seeing their facial expression, their eye contact, things like that, I think are massive for me. That gives me confidence in what they're offering, and you can pick up on more subtle signs. Talking over the phone and talking like this is much harder, in my opinion. I don't know whether Ged will agree, but and I think, yeah, there's certainly been situations where you walk away and you're like, well, that's not somebody that I want to be dealing with. Essentially, it's and it might be a very, obviously from a business point of view, you always have to analyze everything, but it's so there's people that you want to work with and there's people that you don't, and I think that's probably a very vague answer, but it's I think you pick up on a lot of things by body language and kind of the type of people that you want to work with as well.
I think body language is a whole hour, at least an hour in itself. Actually, there's all the things that you can do. Actually, you can think about people's professional flinches if you've got someone around and there's a sharp intake of breath. That's all that about body language. For me, I think one of the most powerful things actually is smiling. So if you're smiling and actually if you're open, then actually think about it, then that's much harder for someone to come back to you. So actually to being smiling, open, I think, but also think about actually, well, what is this negotiation? Is it a one-off, or is it something where I'm going to coming back to? Always think about the different types of negotiation that you're in, and think about the body language that you want to have. What you want, the most important thing actually, is be confident. And the more you negotiate, the more you think about it, the more confident you'll become. And the more confident you'll become, then your shoulders will be back and you will be standing straight, all these different things that actually you'll walk in knowing that you're going to get the best deal.
That's it. And then you'll be on The Apprentice and winning. So so thank you both so much. We really appreciate especially your insights and your experience. And thank you everybody else for tuning in. Once again, the recording will be available on our YouTube channel and sent round. Thank you everybody, and Jed's details are there, my details are there. Please feel free to get in touch, and we'll see you at the next webinar. Thank you all and good evening.
Thanks, bye.